Tracy, nice to have all of you with me. In grim times, it is wonderful to do things that make you happy. And one thing that makes me very happy is to have Sherrod Brown join me. Sherrod and I came to the Senate the same time. We'd won the same election. We both were the disfavored initially primary person, but came through and won. And, the Senate has the occasional geezer in it, and they weren't very good at separating out who was Sheldon and who was Sherrod among the two new kids. So we started calling each other Shellrod just to add to the confusion a bit. So Shellrod, welcome. I couldn't be happier than to have you here. How are you doing?
Good to be with you, Sheldon. One of my favorite members of the Senate, as Sheldon said, came the same year. There was one member of the Senate particularly that couldn't tell us apart. I mean, we don't look that much alike, but anyway, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I really appreciate Sheldon taking on Trump and all their corruption and all their grifting and all their overreach and all their corporate money and all that he's doing. And I said to him before the show, I wish that way more senators on our side had the guts of Sheldon Whitehouse and did what he needed to do and what we all need to do.
So how's post-Senate life? Are you decompressed?
It's good. My wife teaches at Denison, and she hurt her shoulder back in January, and I was her driver 2.5 hours. We'd drive to Granville, Ohio. I would hang out at the student library at Denison. I'd write for 4 or 5 hours and then pick her up and head back. And that was once a week, so I enjoyed that. I'm not living a 15-minute schedule. I do wish I were still there. I mean, I didn't win my election in a state that is drifting more and more Republican, but I'm fighting back in a number of ways, and we can talk about that, or we can talk about whatever you want. But I wanted to say one other thing. I apologize for the mess behind me. This is Connie's library. My wife is a very good writer, as many of you know.
Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. I can brag on her.
Thank you for that. And the room's a mess because we're in the midst of moving from Cleveland to Columbus, and we're getting rid of a lot of books. We're getting rid of a lot of stuff, and it's not much fun. But we're moving because of our 8 grandchildren. 5 of them will live 10 minutes away in Columbus instead of 2 hours from Cleveland, and we have 2 grandchildren, I would add, in Rhode Island. So
That's the important part.
And they have 2 really good senators in your state, and in my state, not so much. But so my one other thing I wanted to say, our son-in-law is a naturalized citizen from El Salvador. And I would suggest, I would imagine most of you have done this, but if you've never been to a naturalization ceremony, they're about an hour long. They're free. They're at the courthouse, or he was naturalized at the public library in Cranston. And it's just nothing like it. And it just shows you how great our country is when you see all these people that want to become citizens, and they all vote. And I don't know how they vote. I can guess for many cases, but it's a wonderful thing to see these. So if you haven't been to one, go to one. Sheldon, I know, has been to a number of them, and there's nothing like it. So I'm done.
They are great. They are great. So how is Ohio doing in the Trump administration? Are those costs down there yet?
People are unhappy. I think, Trump, people wanted a wrecking ball. And, you can see in 2016, the country flipped from Democrat to Republican. 2020 flipped from Republican to Democrat. 2024, people want change. They want upheaval. They want maybe even destruction of what they had, certainly disruption, but they didn't want what Trump's doing, what he's doing with this scatterbrain tariff policy. We can talk more about that. What he's doing with the VA, what he's doing with Medicaid, especially. Sheldon and I worked years ago on a Medicare buy-in issue that we got that close to getting, Medicare, not Medicaid. And, the public wants creative things like that. If they want disruption, it's in their favor, not disruption that helps the grifters that are in charge of this government now. And I think people in Democratic and Republican states are seeing that.
So you mentioned trade and tariffs, and you actually wrote a book on trade and tariffs when you were in the House, and I actually read it when I was in the Senate. because being an attorney general doesn't teach you a lot about trade and tariffs. So I consider you to be sort of my favorite expert on trade and tariffs. And it doesn't seem like they've really got a very good handle on this whole situation.
Yeah, I thank you for that. Sheldon was probably the only person this call that bought and read my book, The Myths of Free Trade, but nonetheless, I mean, I've used tariffs. I've testified probably in my 30 years in the House and Senate, probably 25 times. I've testified in the International Trade Commission about tariffs that are well reasoned, that are aimed at countries that cheat. Sometimes China, sometimes Mexico, sometimes Turkey, and that's a policy that works when countries cheat. Trump, people again, they wanted Trump to disrupt, and disruption is and can work, but not when it's scatterbrained, not when there is no real strategy, and not when it's done the way he's done it with no strategy. So my fear though is Democrats criticize Trump's policy, and we're right to do that. But many, particularly Wall Street Democrats, and Sheldon's certainly not one of those, want to go back to the neoliberal policy that brought NAFTA, that brought most favored nation status with China, that cost places, and I know what's happened to industry in Rhode Island. It's happened in Ohio, it's happened in Rhode Island, where middle class, generally good paid union jobs have disappeared. And so Democrat workers have lost trust in our party in far too many cases. And we'd see the damage it's done to communities in Rhode Island that were industrial communities. We've seen what it's done to communities all over the country. So a coherent trade policy can use tariffs, not a scatterbrained across the board. And Trump also did it this way, so he could have these countries mostly, and companies come to him and beg, and he can wield power over them, which is what he's all about. So
extract favors and monetary tributes as well.
Yeah, kind of like the old overlord, the old kings would do, the old monarchs would do. Exactly.
I followed Jason Furman on a TV show a couple of weeks ago, and he was the top economics guy for Obama, I guess.
Right.
And he said, all this confusion with the jumping around all the time, never knowing what the actual tariff is going to be a month or 6 months from now. He said, that's actually, the confusion is a tariff itself. It's just a really stupid one because it creates no revenue. So we're certainly seeing the effects of just the uncertainty.
Yeah.
Businesses not knowing what the hell it's going to be like 6 months from now. He's had 4 tariff levels on China in 4 months.
And businesses want some kind of predictability, some kind of coherent policy, and they're not getting that. And that's some, I think. I mean, they can deal with whatever a Congress or a president wants. And Trump has also very much overstepped the congressional role in tariffs and trade, but he's had no Republican senators. I was saying to Sheldon that Teddy Roosevelt was very unhappy with Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom he had appointed to the court. And Roosevelt said you could carve a better man out of a banana than Oliver Wendell Holmes. And, that's the backbone, or the lack of a backbone, we're seeing in this U.S. Senate. I mean, Sheldon knows better than I, and I know a number of the Republicans, and every wave of new Republican senators really is worse than the last one. It's a group of people that don't stand up to Trump. It's a group of people that believe in the government is for grifting, not for public policy, and it hurts the country, clearly.
Boy, talk about the scale of the grifting. We're closing in on the House trying to figure out this reconciliation bill, and I'm assuming that they'll allow themselves to be bullied into shape on that. Then it will come over to the Senate. There'll be a whole other bunch of internal wrangling. But at the end of the day, this bill, after all the lectures that you and I used to get about the debt and the deficit, I mean, the Republicans could not get off the stump about lecturing us about the debt and the deficit. Now they've got the trifecta, the presidency, the House, and the Senate. and their first big piece of reconciliation legislation, they have to include a $4 trillion increase to the debt limit because they're adding so much to the debt. And guess what? It's mostly for their big donors and the big corporations, and even to help offshoring. Huge provisions in there to help offshoring of jobs and investment. So much for like Mr. America first.
Well,
But
the debt would be higher, except they're going to cut Medicaid and cut SNAP benefits and all those things to in part pay for it. And I think you all know in this show that Sheldon sits in the finance committee and is really good at taking on these interest groups and standing up to the chairman. He's a nice guy, but is a tool of every one of these interest groups that in the end have their hands out and get most of what they ask for and demand.
well, my seat has moved up the finance committee a bit for the worst of all possible reasons, because we lost you and
Bob Casey
and others.
Yeah.
Debbie retired and so forth. But one of the things that you really put a lot of work into, and were kind of the champion of on the finance committee, was the child tax credit. And that'd be kind of a nice thing to put in the way we wanted it into this bill to actually really help low-income families with children in a way that really made a difference. We actually saw that play out, you remember? Because you got it passed during COVID for a short period of time. That was the best that we could do at the time. And it actually worked in people's lives in a demonstrable way. We had the beta test and it was fabulous. And then the clock ran out on it and it was too good. So the Republicans wouldn't extend it.
Yeah, they didn't vote for it and they didn't extend it.
Yeah.
We had a 50-50 Senate, and one of the Democrats, who is no longer there, said that all these people do is use it to buy drugs, the tax cut they got. But it was the families of 60 million children. In my state alone, the families of 2 million children got between about 3,000 and, if they had more children, 5,000 or 6,000 a year tax cut, and dropped the poverty rate 40%. It made huge difference, but we couldn't hold our 50 votes, and it disappeared. Republicans again didn't join us. It's the most important thing I did in my Senate career. I think that and some pension bills. But it'll be we'll have it another day. It's just now you got to fight back against all these things they're doing to middle class families.
Yeah. One of the things that was really annoying in that argument was the Republicans saying, well, if you give this child tax credit, that's just going to add more income to these families, and that will take the pressure off them from going out to work. So basically what you're doing is subsidizing a bunch of couch potatoes. And in real life, in Rhode Island, what we actually saw was people took that money, used it to pay for childcare so that they could get out and work. Did you see that in Ohio as well?
I think you saw it everywhere.
Yeah.
You saw things like families that, couldn't have, it helped families with school supplies. So their kid could maybe be in theater or do something that she might not have been able to do. It helped kids with daycare, as you suggested, help people fix their cars. I mean, it was per child between $250 and $300 a month. And that means a whole lot to a family that's struggling. And they said the families of 60 million children benefited. And a lot of those were people living on the edge. And for people that were doing a little better, maybe they could go to a movie, take their kids to a movie. I mean, it's just the greed, the grifting and the greed in among Senate Republicans and House Republicans is just sometimes hard to measure and hard to believe.
I remember way back when reading about people who had voted for FDR and talking to people who voted for Jack Kennedy saying, well, the good thing about being rich in politics is that you're too rich to want to steal. So you're just going to look out for people. Boy, this billionaire crowd around Trump has certainly blown the too rich to steal theory out of the water.
Well, I think both Kennedy and Roosevelt their families imbued them, if that's the right verb, with some empathy in their lives, growing up and realizing how lucky they were to be born into that. And we certainly don't see that now. And with Trump, who had everything given to him and squandered most of it, and so many of the billionaire friends, some of them sort of, but even the ones that are quote unquote self-made need to think the reason they could do that was the system we have in this country that made it possible to get rich. And like the way George Soros talks about it, that, he came here, he had advantages and opportunities, and he used them. But most of this crowd thinks they earned every cent, as you know.
I particularly love that Commerce Secretary billionaire who said that if there was a interruption of benefits,
Yeah,
so that his mother didn't get her Social Security any longer, she'd be fine with that. Well, not everybody has a billionaire son in whose mansion they live and can get along just fine with that Social Security. That was one of the moments where I just thought, oh my God, where are these people coming from? How can you think that way?
and he's been charged with foreign policy negotiations because he knew how to negotiate as a real estate guy in New York. A lot of similarities there, of course.
Of course. So you mentioned the Medicare buy-in, which back in the day, you and I worked on together, tried to get into the Obamacare bill. We called it the public option.
Yep.
Let me ask you to reflect a little bit on that and what you think our best healthcare prospects are going forward.
Well, our first mission, I mean, your first mission, I'm not there to make these decisions, but is to protect Medicaid from what they're going to do. And
Yeah.
one of the things they forget about Medicaid is that most of the rural hospitals in my state simply would collapse without Medicaid. It matters in Providence, it matters in Cleveland, it matters dealing in low income areas, but those hospitals have other ways of surviving, as damaging as just the big Medicaid cuts would be. But these rural hospitals in places like Zanesville or Mansfield, Ohio, where I grew up, or even smaller communities, I don't know what they do if they have these Medicaid cuts. And those smaller communities, as you know, you have a state that's more urban than mine in terms of the proportion of population. But what's happened is more and more, the metro areas are more and more Democratic, and the rural areas are more and more Republican, even a faster division there. And in rural areas are hit the hardest by so much of this, so much of the cuts in broadband, the cuts in Medicaid to rural hospitals, the cuts in veterans benefits, or the cuts in Social Security benefits, where they're closing offices in small towns and rural areas with the same attitude as the Secretary of Commerce has. Well, it may hurt people a little bit, but they'll survive. And they won't. And eventually those voters are going to see that so I've said in politics many times, politics isn't left or right, it's really who's on your side. And people more and more are seeing that Sheldon Whitehouse and the way he thinks about things are more on their side than the way that Mitch McConnell or Speaker Johnson or whoever thinks.
And actually in Rhode Island, we're seeing nursing homes even more vulnerable to Medicaid cuts than hospitals. So I can only imagine what rural nursing homes are like, given that rural hospitals are going to take it harder than urban hospitals. So I should let you go in a moment, but we do have a question from Phyllis from Lincoln, which is perfectly adapted to you. So if you don't mind,
Phyllis,
I'll let you take a swing at it. Phyllis from Lincoln asks, how can American workers ever be competitive with such cheap labor overseas? Can you speak also to limits on CEO pay?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a good tax policy. I don't know that there was a bill when I was years ago. I think it's when Sheldon and I came to the House that the companies couldn't deduct the pay for executives that were making above a certain level. I think it was $1 million. They can still pay them that much. They couldn't deduct it. And also, there have been ways of prohibiting stock buybacks when these companies, there's real incentive for these companies to screw their workers. We've seen all kinds of efforts to fight unionization. One of the most important things of unions, and Rhode Island was a union state as Ohio was, is they are able to help workers sharing the wealth they create. That's not socialism, that's capitalism, but giving workers a seat at the table. And on all these issues, on trade agreements, if workers had had a seat at the table during NAFTA, NAFTA was 1993. And I heard about NAFTA in my campaign in places like Youngstown and Dayton because they know the damage it did. And what we were trying to do with NAFTA was to empower workers at the table, to empower them to raise labor standards in places like Mexico. And particularly if they're democratic countries, you can do that. And that's a major component on making all of this happen.
And the competitive American workforce against cheap foreign labor.
Yeah, it's I mean the way to do that in part is give workers a seat at the table in terms of unionization, in terms of trade policy, in terms of how you do tariffs, on all those things. And Sheldon, sitting on the tax committee, has had a lot of thoughts on that. He's not in the majority to do it now, but he will be at some point. And I think that some point is going to come sooner rather than later because of what Trump and his sycophants in the Senate and House are doing.
If we actually had proper tariffs on countries that either used slave labor or such cheap labor that people are miserable and can't survive, so that they were actually incented in order to get into our markets to pay a decent living wage in their own countries, think how much of a calmer and safer place the whole world would be.
Yep. Doing selective tariffs in a coherent, cogent way could make all the difference in the world. Yep, exactly right.
Well, you've been terrific to join me, Sherrod. It just makes me miss you all the more. But I hope you come visit your Rhode Island grandchildren. We have a chance to catch up, or you come to Washington if you can bear it. And we have a chance to catch up again there.
I go to Rhode Island more than I go to Washington. So thank you.
There you go.
Thanks, and keep fighting the way you are. You are such an important national voice in all of this. So thank you all for having me.
I promise, pal. I promise.
Thanks, buddy. All right.
So our next question comes from Aggie from North Kingstown. And her question is, what is the plan for getting big money out of politics? Which is actually a really good question for me because it's my bill that would get the big money out of politics. So the wretched Citizens United decision let unlimited money into politics. And then the court refused to enforce the part of the decision that had said that money was going to be transparent. And that's where we got dark money. That's where we got super PACs that hide who the donor is. That's how we got this whole crooked arrangement where a billionaire sets up a 501c3, gets a tax deduction for his donation to his 501c3, transfers it into the 501c4, which is often in the same office, although they're supposedly different entities. The 501c4 gives the money to a super PAC. The super PAC says, okay, I declare where I got that money from. The 501c4, nobody knows who the real donor is except the candidate, the campaign people, the party leaders, and the donor. It's the rest of us that are just left out of it. So that's the racket that is going on right now. My bill will make sure that any contribution into a campaign over $10,000, you got to tell everybody who you are. You can't do that anonymously. And I really, really, really deeply believe that if these big donors who are dropping $10 million, $50 million, whatever checks into races through this hidden array of front groups, if we got to find out who they really were, most of it would go away. I mean, if you're ExxonMobil and you want to beat me up and you come into Rhode Island with like Rhode Islanders for peace and puppies and prosperity and dump a bunch of poisonous ads against me, that's one thing. If at the end the ad says, we're from ExxonMobil and we approve this message, everybody in Rhode Island gets the joke. The whole advertisement becomes useless. In fact, I would probably invite them to keep running it. So disclosure really, 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 really makes a difference. It's hugely popular. It's equally popular with Republicans and Democrats, but we didn't jam it through when we had the chance, and the Republicans always try to block it. So that's how we get the big money out of our politics. We take away the ability to make those donations anonymous. The next one is from Mark from Bristol. Can extension of the Trump tax cuts for the 0.01% be stopped? This will blow up the economy. We talked about that a little bit with Sherrod. We don't know quite how the Republicans are going to pull this off, but clearly it's their intention to give a massive tax payback to the big donors, the 0.01%. It's like a wheel. The big donors give, let's say, 10, 50, $100 million to the Republican Party and spread it out through all these dark money channels. And then that puts the Republicans in power, and they go to the tax code, and out of the Treasury, they pay back those same big donor billionaires, but they pay them like $10 for every dollar invested, $100 for every dollar invested. They get this huge, huge payback from the investment that they've made in Republican politics, knowing that that's what they'll do. So the Republicans are determined to make sure that they make those payoffs. And we just have to fight it like hell and hope that we can stop it. And if we get the chance with some good, lucky elections, to do everything we can to turn it around. It is preposterous, it is sickening, and it is wrong that a billionaire pays a lower tax rate than a firefighter. Period. End of story. That ought to be something everybody can agree on. Nope. Even that is too much for the Republicans because they're so dependent on the big donors. So what Marjorie from Little Compton, all right. What is being done to help nonprofit organizations in Rhode Island that have had their grants canceled because of Elon Musk and his muskrats and doggy and all of that? Well, couple of things. First of all, Peter Nerona and other attorneys general and Democracy Forward and other litigating groups are going to court because most of the cancellation of these grants was illegal or unconstitutional or both. So people are winning those cases. So that means that the Trump administration hides and tries to pretend that it's not holding the money, so you can't get straight answers. So one thing that's important, if you are in a nonprofit and you have federal grants and you're not getting that funding, you need to let me know. You need to let Jack Reed know, or Gabe Emo know, or Seth Magaziner know. Doesn't matter which door you knock on, but we need to know because then we can pursue that, and also the attorney generals can pursue that. So that's probably the key thing. If you're not getting the funding you deserve, let us know, and we can plug it back into that litigation cycle. Very often there's a court order already saying that the funds should flow, and the Trumpsters are just hiding and dancing, trying to avoid complying with the court order without being caught being a direct, obvious no that would put them under sanctions from the court for disobedience. Gregory, if Trump does not enact sanctions against Russia for not negotiating with Ukraine fairly, should Congress? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I'm one of the original co-sponsors of a bipartisan bill with Dick Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham to pound them with sanctions, which include things like what we should have done better before, going after the oil shipments out. They're making a bundle from shipping oil. It's nominally sanctioned, but we haven't done a good job to block it. The enforcement has not been anywhere near as effective as it should be. And here's the last thing for Ukraine. I got a bill passed that allowed the Treasury, the United States Treasury, to take Russian assets that are frozen in the United States and not just freeze them, but actually seize them, take them, and give them to Ukraine. And we unfortunately don't have a whole lot of that money. We got maybe $5 or $6 billion. But over in Europe, they have around $300 billion, around a third of $1 trillion that is Russian sovereign wealth money, but it's frozen. So it's just sitting there. But repo, if the UK and the EU would do the same thing, they could take that 300 billion along with our smaller piece, and we could start sending that to Ukraine. And from a leverage point of view, probably best not to do that all at once. But how about $20 billion a month to Ukraine? Vladimir, there went 20 billion. Too bad. Next month, here comes, another 20 million. There it went. Up third month, another 20 billion. Boy, these 20 billions are disappearing. Fourth, oh no, 80 billion now you've lost. Some point as he's walking along that, he starts to take negotiating seriously. Trump has put zero pressure on Putin. I don't know what Trump Russia is, but I'll tell you what it isn't. It is not a hoax. Linda from Portsmouth, how can we fight against the planned gutting of Medicaid and Medicare? So what I tell people is go through, I don't have my phone right on me, go through your phone, find your contacts, scroll through and find people who you know, who you trust, who you like, who are friends of yours, who live in states with a Republican senator, like Florida, like Maine, like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, and reach out to them and say, hey, would you please call your senator's office, let them know you're a constituent in their home state, and tell them how bad it's going to be if they continue with this Medicaid stuff. I think they're starting to sweat about it. Just this morning, Trump went into the House Republicans to try to jam the bill through that has the huge Medicaid cuts. And wild as he is, he said, don't F with Medicare, Medicaid. About the bill he's trying to push through that does exactly that to Medicaid. You have to wonder if he knows what's in the bill. But clearly, Trump has a sensitivity that if you F with Medicaid, you're going to hurt an awful lot of voters, an awful lot of his base. And people are going to be furious. As Sherrod says, if a rural hospital closes down in a red state because the Republicans voted to cut Medicaid, that is not a good look. So we have to keep that pressure on. And it matters to senators, even Republican ones, to hear from their home state constituents. So figure out who you know who is a home state constituent of a Republican senator and sick them on that senator. So, by the way, I think Medicare is kind of okay for now. My other worry, Medicaid's the biggest worry. The other worry would be Social Security, actually, because when those muskrats got in there and started ripping it up, it looked like the plan was to basically break it, have it fail just in terms of administration, have the old computer system break down, whatever, so that there was an interruption of Social Security benefits. And then they would come in like heroes, the tech bros and the muskrats and the private equity people, and say, we're here to save the day. We're going to take over Social Security. And they end up privatizing it in a big, basically theft operation. So I'm keeping my eye on that very, very carefully. Lori from Riverside was recently laid off as a nurse of 35 years. What is the plan in Rhode Island to prevent further decline of medical care? Well, this gets a little bit wonky, excuse me, but one of my favorite things would be to get us off of fee-for-service payment for doctors. That's when you do a thing, you get paid. You do another thing, you get paid. You do a different thing, you get paid. Don't do those things, don't get paid. Do many of those things, get paid a lot. That disrupts the patient relationship because you're not paying attention to the patient any longer. You're just paying attention to what are the procedures, what are the office visits, what are the prescriptions, what are the things that I can do that get me reimbursement. And if we get off that, and by the way, yay, Rhode Island, we were some of the best medical practices at starting to get off that. Coastal Medical, Integra, they killed it. They were so good. And then they got kind of as far as they could. And so now we're trying to move to the next phase, which is called the ahead phase. And I won't go into the details, but it moves further away from fee-for-service and more to what's called value-based care. And we got to keep fighting with the federal government to get Rhode Island paid fairly. Rhode Island Hospital gets paid less for the same procedure that St. Anne's Hospital does in Fall River. I got nothing against St. Anne's Hospital in Fall River. I'm sure it's a great place, but they don't have the heavy duty trauma care. They don't have the advanced equipment. They don't have the specialized research. They're not a teaching hospital. Rhode Island Hospital does a ton of really champion stuff, and yet for the same procedure is paid less just because we're in Rhode Island. And I've won one big fight in this area that narrowed the gap, but we have got a big fight ahead of us. I raised it when Secretary Kennedy came through. I raised it when CMS Administrator Oz came through, and I'm going to keep after them. That would make such a big difference. It's ridiculous for us to be in a payment hole compared to both Connecticut and Massachusetts when we're actually in the same medical region. What else have I got here? Stephen R. I'm concerned with GOP organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society manipulating Republicans. Is there any way to address their shadow wielding of our government? Well, Stephen, first of all, bravo you for being alert to the Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society shadow wielding of our government. I'm about to give my 300th time to wake up speech, and it's going to be precisely about this problem of the creeping corruption of these creepy billionaires, which have set up this whole apparatus of front groups like Heritage Foundation or Heartland Institute or Federalist Society, or you can name, there are probably 150 of them out there. And they play them like piano keys, and they're all funded through the same money. And they really plan ahead. The capture of the Supreme Court by these guys probably took 20 years. And by our count, they spent about $600 million doing it. And that's only the money we've been able to trace. They might have spent 5 times that. So they really plan ahead, and being alert to the mischief of these front groups is absolutely critical. And the stage we're in right now is that these front groups that used to just manufacture propaganda and put out the nonsense that their big donors wanted, they now have actually inserted themselves into government. They're actually the shadow government that is running the proper agencies of government. And in that sense, it's really quite the billionaire takeover of the government, because it's not just the billionaire coming in at the top, in come the whole apparatus. And they can move in and run things. There's a bug, there's a kind of wasp that can plant its larvae in another bug. And as the larvae grows, it can take over the nervous system of the other bug in which it was planted. And like somebody driving a car around, they take over the host bug and they start driving it around, doing basically whatever they want. And I think of that analogy, it's some kind of a wasp. Anyway, I think of that analogy when I think of these guys in the government, that the body of the government is still there, but the control is the wasp larvae that's in there and that has basically assumed the command and control function of the bug. And it's really important to get that word out there so people understand what is happening. So, Stephen, bravo, and thank you. In the future, how long would it take to reverse the wealthy and corporate tax breaks? Well, that all depends on voters, I'm afraid to say. That's Hallie B asking the question, by the way. There was actually a moment when I had hopes that Democrats would win the trifecta in the last election. And boy, was I wrong. They won the trifecta, so they've got control over the whole operation. If we were to get control over the trifecta, we could do that very rapidly. We should have done it before. I tried. We even lost a few Democrats from time to time that prevented us from getting it done. We could have gotten rid of the carried interest thing that lets big private equity people pay low tax rates by pretending that their earnings are actually capital gains that should be taxed less than regular income. We had one particular senator who just simply wouldn't go for that, one Democrat. She kept us from being able to accomplish that. So I think in the future, we'll find that Democrats will be better disciplined now that they've watched what the Republicans have done and how they've been able to ram stuff through with tiny majorities, even when some of them don't agree. Better to get it done and move on than it is to quarrel and stop. So I hope we've learned that lesson. But as soon as we have the votes, but even if we don't have the full trifecta, I think, with the negotiating leverage and a powerful voice, you can get a lot done, even if you don't control all the levers of power. And after we've seen what these guys have done to make the tax code even more corrupted and disgraceful, it's going to be a priority. Susan has come in across Instagram. Is there any legislative pathway to undo the SCOTUS presidential immunity decision? It's not easy because, the obvious way would be to just do a constitutional amendment that solved it. But because Chief Justice Roberts stood that decision in the Constitution itself, it's a matter of now having to fix that. There may be ways to try to figure out workarounds. I think one way would be term limits on the court. And once you got some more sensible justices in, they'd realize that they'd really gone out on a crazy limb. Imagine what he must be thinking about this right now. When you look at all the madcap criminal behavior around the Trump administration, and they got to feel like some responsibility for having unleashed this. I don't think this is what they bet on when they issued that decision. So I wish I had a better answer for that. I'll make one observation though. There is immunity in the Constitution. It just happens to be immunity for us. It's immunity for legislators. Why did the founding fathers put immunity for legislators in the Constitution? They put immunity for legislators in the Constitution because they were afraid that a Justice Department like Donald Trump's would go after legislators like the one they just decided to charge with a crime and interfere with the legislative body, either intimidate them into voting the way they want or prevent them from getting to the Senate in order to be able to register their votes. Whatever the rationale was, it was to protect the legislative branch from the executive branch. So they knew how to do immunity if they wanted to, and they chose not to put in any immunity from the president. And here it is 230 whatever years later, 250 years later nearly, and suddenly this little majority on this little court decides to create this monstrosity of a fake presidential immunity. So, Harold from Pawtucket, when you speak to your Republican colleagues, are they expressing any concerns about the economic damage Trump and his administration are doing? Some are just like drank the Kool-Aid, they are all in. Some are getting more and more anxious. And my theory, we'll see whether this works, my theory is that the stampede is probably going to continue for a little while. And it's just like, do it. Don't stop to think. But then ultimately, particularly after the reconciliation bill, the tax bill is done, then we end up going away for the August recess and going home. And by the time they come back next fall, parents around the country will have been doing their back to school shopping. And they'll have gone to their Walmart or Target or wherever they like to shop, and they'll have found that prices went up because of the tariffs. And they may even find that some of the goods that they like to buy aren't even on the shelves because they never came through from China. The container ships turned around. So I think the combination of time at home listening to voters and voters starting to be hit by the economic effects of the tariffs and the shadow of that next November election, about a year out, you really start to think about that, means that a whole new outlook on life begins to emerge. But privately, they're concerned. Privately, they're concerned about some of the legal madness, and privately, they're concerned about whether or not the Trump administration will violate court orders. They're always threatening to violate court orders. They haven't really done it yet. They've been cute. Maybe they violated the court order, but there's not been a flagrant, direct violation yet. And I think part of that is a very strong signal they got from a bunch of Republican senators saying, no, 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 no. We got enough trouble with you. Don't go there. Well, here's a tough one. Dina, excuse my cough. I got a tickle in my throat. How can we survive Donald Trump and keep our democracy? Well, I think it's just going to take a lot of things working together. I think so far, the federal courts have actually done a very good job. Most of the good work is happening down in the lower courts. It doesn't get up to the Supreme Court where they can fix it. It's down in the lower courts. And some of it is super boring. It is, did you violate the Administrative Procedures Act, right? What could be possibly more boring than that? But when you're litigating that, you get discovery. You get to find out what they were saying behind the scenes. We now know from litigation what the EPA folks were saying behind the scenes when they were freezing all those different funds. Well, it doesn't look good. In fact, their lawyers had to go and admit it. Okay, you're right. We blew it. So we have that information. So there's that. Voters are going to be more and more fed up, particularly when the economic hit comes through. Democrats have finally settled on, I think, a sensible message that the chaos and the cost increases and the corruption of the Trump administration are bad, and that's starting to stick. So it is not going to be pretty, and they're going to continue to be up to no good. And some of the stuff that's coming out of like the Department of Justice is really horrifying, but he's not gaining ground. His numbers are sliding away. Anxiety among Republicans is growing. The public is much more motivated than it was just 2 months ago. And so, we're beginning to organize. As my dear Barbara Mikulski, who was the senior woman in the Senate when I got here, used to say, don't agonize, organize. So my advice to anybody out there is, if you're feeling distressed, if you're worried about the future of our democracy, go join up. Find a group that you like. Find a group that aligns with your values and participate. You'll feel less distressed when you're around other people working on a common goal. Your voice will be amplified by the group. And together, we will fight our way back and make this an America we can be proud of. Thanks for joining me. So glad we